The National Assessment of Educational Progress, widely regarded as the nation's report card, tells us that over two-thirds of American kids are not proficient at grade level in any subject. That's math, it's reading, geography, history, and among immigrants and minorities, the numbers are even worse. In the D.C. school system, which has the second highest per capita per student expenditure in the country, only 17% of Black and Latino eighth graders were doing math or English at grade level. That's 1 in 6 performing at grade level, which is about the same rate for minority students nationwide. And this has been true for decades. I think this is a crime. Isn't it time we did something about it?
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
K through 12 schools in America are broken. Not for all kids, but for most kids. Schools in America are broken, and we need to address it. With me today to talk about that is Jeanne Allen, who's the longtime friend of mine and founder of Center for Education Reform, and who I consider the leading advocate for educational change in America.
Hey, Bill.
Welcome, Jeanne. And also joining me is my bride, Sarah, who's an outstanding painter, but more pertinent to this show, she was CEO for a while of a business we formed to teach Spanish and language to kids JK through 6th grade in public schools and private schools throughout the Midwest. And at its peak, we had about 20,000 kids enrolled in both an after-school and in-curriculum program in a number of places. And Sarah has a few stories to share about that experience.
I always say that Bill was the brains and I was the brawn.
Well, you carried all the books around.
I did.
But you designed all the books. Jeanne, let's kick off with a couple things that are on my mind that we talked about before the show. There's a book written by almost 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, by E.D. Hirsch on the schools we need. And then another book that came out about 10 years ago, Real Education by Charles Murray. And in both of them, they talk about educational romanticism. In E.D. Hirsch's case, he talks about romanticism as it pervades the curriculum as it's been designed. And in Charles's case, he points out that, kids vary distinctly in terms of ability and ability to succeed in school. So our expectations that every kid is going to do great in school and go to Harvard just isn't realistic, and we need an education system that addresses that fact. Thoughts?
There is romanticism, both in the way Hirsch and Murray describe it, but also across our country, we find our schools and the education of our kids is just so lovely. I mean, think about when you're preparing your kids to go to school and when they come home with their first report cards and how proud we are when they're honors students. And we just think everything's great until reality hits and we actually read the data. And so when there are problems, we tend to think it's because of somebody else's kids, or it tends to be an anomaly, or we think, oh my gosh, my child has a disability. And so beyond the lack of really strong curriculum and the fact that we think everyone is already getting educated, parents and the general public have this sense that, it's just the most wonderful thing to ever happen to you to enter into the public education system.
Well, and we've talked about this before, it's sort of like your local congressman. Everybody thinks Congress is terrible, except maybe their congressman's okay.
Right.
Same thing with schools. Everybody says, well, schools are broken, they need fixed, we need radical change. Yet my school's pretty nice, and I like the people, and we're across the street from an elementary school, and it's just the most charming place imaginable, yet it's not producing the outcomes that we need.
And I totally agree with you, and I say what I said with just some regret, because it is a fundamental time in your child's life. It's a fundamental time in your community. It's where you make your friends. It's where great cultural events happen, where you can develop the mind and the body. But as Hirsch points out, Bill, as you know, the content is so uneven and so unequal across the country in terms of what kids know and be able to do. It's why he took off with cultural literacy and wrote those books, what your fourth graders should know, your fifth graders should know. And he stunned people by saying it because they thought everybody was already learning the things that he said they were learning.
Well, he said this started, and I said we were going to name names, I hoped, who the culprits behind some of this. It started with the Teachers College in Columbia University in New York in 1918, and they wrote something about the ideal curriculum and said it shouldn't be fact-based, it should be based on attributes, and consequently curriculum development fell into this sort of what he calls the romantic mode, and we've really been there ever since, where that's considered to be the cause célèbre if you're an educator. I mean, if our language kids, Sarah, had that view, would you just be teaching them French culture, not how to actually speak the language?
That was what a lot of schools wanted.
So I'm curious too. So most schools just thought, well, let's just talk about France. Why require them to know something?
Well, let me start with my best story. We were recommended by the head of foreign languages at the Chicago Public School to go out to Schaumburg, which is a suburb of Chicago that had 28 new elementary schools, and they were starting a Spanish program. And it's overwhelming. So I went out to see the head of curriculum, and I showed her our program. We had books, audio tapes, teacher guides, flashcards, games, songs. And she said, okay, I'll take the books, but not the audio tapes. And I said, but it won't work then. And her response was, we don't want the Spanish program to be better than the math program. We don't want to raise parental expectations. And I knew right then the program was going to fail, and they were going to blame it on our books.
You know what's so amazing about that story? I literally just heard about Schaumburg, Illinois, a day before I just sat down with you all.
Oh.
And the story was how bad the schools were there at one point, and how bad the college system was there, because they were getting students who, like most colleges in this country, have to remedial educate, something like 75% of colleges and universities. And someone came along, and I'm not entirely sure, and we should find out and maybe report on it afterwards, and completely changed the way the schools interact with the community colleges, and lifted and made it much more personalized, much more adaptive, so that students actually going into community colleges are on a career path and have mastered some incredible amounts of knowledge and content before they get there. And so someone figured out that
So
they
they
were
fixed
literally
it.
as
They fixed
ignorant. It sounds like it's on its way
Yeah.
to being more innovative. So maybe they had hit rock bottom, but what a comment for people to make.
Well, one of the things we found was that we were teaching not only in nice suburbs like Schaumburg, we were teaching inner city, south side Chicago. And in some ways, one of my thoughts was that these schools in the ghetto were actually better schools than the ones in the suburbs, because they had to do more with less, and the kids coming into the school were not well prepared by their parents to succeed. Yet if you're in Schaumburg, the parents are out there, reading the kids early, doing most of the work, and so the variable that schools are in terms of bringing about change in kids it's surprising. I thought the inner city schools in some ways were doing a better job.
Well, it's interesting, because what's happened is this really interesting shift dating back to when you're kind of putting a pin on the map on teacher education, and this notion that there really should be no particular canon, if you will, of knowledge. And yet the schools that are doing great, who have come to be in response to that issue, they don't say that you have to be overly prescriptive, but they do say there has to be a core set of content and expectations. So Boys Latin in Philadelphia, a men's charter school, which requires you to know Latin to be able to recite the school motto in Latin by the time you graduate, which requires literature. Their founder, David Hardy, when he speaks, says, we have demonstrated that you actually can not only teach, but help these students excel and go to college and high career levels, because they are actually enjoying learning. He said, look, learning is actually something we like. It's a natural phenomena.
Right.
And it's what happens to them to deprive them of learning that sets kids into troublemakers or disinterested and breaks down this system we have in this process.
Kids thrive when they can memorize, know facts, can point out things on a map. They love that.
They love that, and they love using it
Yeah.
to then do things that they can carve their own path.
Well, our first through third graders picked up language so much faster than the fourth through sixth graders. It was incredible. And they'd often get ahead. The first through third graders would often get ahead of their non-Spanish speaking teachers. It's incredible.
So the thing we talk about romanticism, we also, last time you were here, we talked, maybe time before, we talked about the structure of schools, about how we've got a 19th century factory model that's been in place where you've got inputs that are managed, and we didn't really talk about so much about the curriculum models that have been are blocking change. And we talk about romanticism. Can you break that down into how curriculum has gone one direction, it could go another with a little more hard-headed approach?
Sure. So let me start by kind of talking about today. Just some fantastic innovations in learning that are happening about a student's ability to drive their own education when given content and good, strong pedagogy. The pedagogy is basically something the student creates themselves by being accessible to content. I mean, look, we're in a day and age of technology. Let me boil it down. And we have access to unbridled opportunities, so many different points of information. So knowledge is no longer a commodity. You can find stuff. It's what you do with it. So the school in Iowa, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where the student is actually creating kind of an architectural model for his school. He had to do math. He had to read certain formulas. He had to draw out something. He had to interact. He had to collaborate. He had to figure out how schools are built. He took something because they give and empower students in a model like that to use the programs around them. So what's happened is we've gone from curriculum is vapid. You don't really need much. You just need to lead kids and they'll thrive. And it could just be the lowest level, lowest common denominator because we don't want to challenge too many people, to a world of standards and assessments, which was very prescriptive. And everyone has to follow in lockstep, and that's the system that we sought to reform with choices in charter schools. Let's get out of this lockstep thing to get more standards. And now we're coming back and saying standards are good, but what are we giving students to do? They've got to learn to be independent. They've got to learn if they're going to be a painter.
Now,
if they're going to be something.
how individual are those programs? I mean, if you've got 25 kids in the room, how many of them are getting the same thing as the others, or you have 25 different things they're doing?
You know, it varies greatly depending on the program, depending on if it's a classroom, depending on the school, but essentially it's a drive towards competency. You should not be able to go from one math class to another unless you're actually competent in the essentials that were in that one math class. So whether it's 10 problems per week, why would you go on to the next 10 if you've got 8 out of 10? Those 2 that you might have gotten wrong, you might have needed as those building blocks. So it's actually partly driven by the student's capacity. At that point, their competency, not capacity. And then the teacher can move around the classroom and look in real time how you're progressing. That is the wave of the future.
But where is this happening? I mean, is it?
In about 100 school districts, in a huge number of charter schools,
Okay.
and then in some private schools more and more.
But we have 30,000 school districts.
Exactly, that's the problem. That's why it's just beginning to scratch the surface.
Well, we got 2/3 of kids not at grade level proficiency in any subject. So
Exactly.
So what are the barriers to this? I've got some candidates here. We talked before about inputs. Schools need to be accredited. So that means if you're going to be in a public school, it's got an accreditation. If you're going to set up a charter school, it goes through the same accreditation process. And that standardizes both models pretty much to not look very different from each other. Or am I listening? Am I getting this right?
No. So we might want to roll back.
Okay.
So public schools
Yeah.
gain their authority simply by the fact they are run by a school district.
Okay.
Charter schools have to go to an authorizer for the quote-unquote accreditation, but they're essentially authorized, and they can operate as long as they've agreed to meet health, safety standards, et cetera, and they have a different boss. Some states it's still the school district, which is not a good law. Some states it's a mayor. Some states it could be a university, an independent authorizer. They both, though, regardless of charter or public, traditional public or charter public, they both are pretty much, even though I favor an option to have more autonomy and choices, they both pretty much are following the traditional model of education because
Right.
they're being held to the same tests and assessments that we put in that say the 25 or 30 kids in a class have to be here at the end of a year. Well, what if you could be much farther ahead? What if you have a completely different interest? What if you've begun to actually tease out that you're of a career and you know in 8th grade where you want to go? Why are you having to sit with everybody else and be taught lockstep?
So I'm still trying to break down the difference between if I'm sending my child to a public school that's run by in the normal manner or a charter school, how different are the standards as to what the schools have to provide? And how much autonomy do they have?
Well, the outcomes are not vastly different, but the autonomy is dramatically different.
Okay.
So the charter, like a private school, can have lots of authority to change the way they do business, which is why so many of the innovations that are actually making their way into lots of different systems in schools today started in charters. So this whole notion of personalized learning, being able to go at your own pace, but at the same time still achieving proficiency in something, is something that was incubated and started in Summit Charter Schools out in California for the first time. Rocket Ship, doing blended learning. The Alliance Ready College Public Schools, same thing. So how they teach, the different levels of teachers, the performance they're held to, much higher, much more diverse, much more innovative because they have that flexibility. But it still doesn't mean every charter, just like every traditional public school, is really using this knowledge of content. I mean, again, going back to E.D. Hirsch and cultural literacy and what students should know. Are we really requiring them to know everything they possibly can know about our world, about our country, about the culture, about arts?
But that still sounds romantic. I mean, is every child, I mean, we mentioned Charles Murray here, and he's a pretty trenchant thinker about some of these things. Wrote the bell curve, and one of his metrics is the IQ, or he calls it G scores, so we don't get into the IQ conference. And he talks about how ability varies wildly among kids, and it's not like woebegone. Half of us are below average, and half of us are above average, and we end up with these schools that assume everybody from 4th grade on is going to be on a college track. And so we set out a curriculum, sort of one size fits all, with standards for the high ability students, same standards for them as maybe the low ability students. What do you think?
Well, I think there's another book out there that actually advances farther the debate on average. It's called The End of Average by
Okay.
Todd Rose,
All right.
who was a welfare father, single parent, who now operates a center at Harvard. And he's actually looked at the data and the research governing what average is. He started with a cockpit for the Navy and how they determined what average was. And he began to realize that around the country, and particularly in education, we set this average. So at one point in time, Charles Murray was right. There was above average, there was below average. I don't think we've ever quite really unpacked the fact, though, that every student starts with a certain level of a foundation. And if
Yeah.
that foundation is lacking, then comparing them to average, whether they're above or below, doesn't serve the purpose. Today, what we can do is we can say, where is your passion? Where is your ability to learn? Where is your interest? What do you do really well? How do you learn to do more of it well? I actually think all of our students at every level,
Yeah.
adults too, we're finding out, are still very, very malleable. They can still learn a lot and do a lot and be retrained.
What was his name?
His name is Todd Rose.
Todd Rose.
And it's a fascinating theory. And if you think of people's brains the way you think of their sizes, there is no average. And so that also speaks to why you need individualized learning. I'm not saying a school that 400 kids are all doing something vastly different, but it's probably a lot like your language programs where people excelled at their own pace. I'm doing Rosetta Stone right now again to practice my Italian to go back to Italy. And I'm at a different pace because I've got stuff going on that doesn't allow me to do it all the time. It's the same with any kind of learning. And so that's where we have to be talking about, whether it's K or career.
The Army does that. I was
Really?
in the Army, and I got sent to Clerk School, which was sort of nice since Vietnam War was raging at the time. And in Clerk School, they give you these stacks of books that go through and, you know, how you type or how you fill out a form or how you do this thing. And it's all standardized. You can go at your own pace. And it was an 8-week course that 8 weeks allotted to it, but you could do it at your own pace. Well, it wasn't that hard. And so it took me about 7 or 8 days to finish the course for the week. And I was also the company platoon leader. And so what I got to do was I would march the rest of the platoon to class, and I'd go play golf in the morning. And then I'd come back for lunch, and then march them back to lunch, and then afterwards,
That must have made you very popular.
no. But my point was, everybody had to have the same outcome in terms of what they knew, and everybody got there. In fact, by the end of it, I had about half the company was off on the golf course with me, so we had a good time.
So great variation in how they got there.
Yeah.
But they all got there. You know, I keep meeting these students who were recipients of an opportunity scholarship, a voucher, or went through a charter school. And the story is the same over and over again. I was a troublemaker. I couldn't do this. I wasn't a good student. I was bad. They thought I was X, Y, and Z. And then I got into a school where they held me to an expectation, and now I'm going to become a nurse. Or now I'm graduating college, and I went and said, I want to work for you. Or now, and no one thought that they could learn. And then they've also uncovered and unlocked their various abilities. And so I think that what we know about the brain today is amazing. And I wonder if Charles Murray, and he's a friend of yours, we should ask him, if he was writing that book in a day and age when technology was as ubiquitous as it is today, where the brain is literally on fire on a regular basis, love it or not, with all of our phones and all of our equipment, it's changing the way we can react and act in the face of information, trauma, danger, or opportunity.
Does that mean the smartphones made us smarter?
Smartphones may have opened up and unlocked
Yeah.
some keys. Maybe
Yeah.
not. Maybe a little bit more ADD, sadly.
Well, but these are all great individual success stories that happen in specific schools. How do you bring about institutional change across the country for these sort of things that work? And, you know, I guess you've cleared my thinking on accreditation, but we've also got teachers' colleges and certification and textbook approval and textbook publishers, and they pretty much operate in lockstep with sort of the old paradigm.
We need a complete transformation
Yeah,
in the way we do education at every level,
yeah.
from K through career. What we've been talking about a lot, and I know this is an interest of yours, is are we preparing students for something they can do for life? More than half the kids are kids who go to a four-year college will not complete it. Well over half, I mean something like more than 60 million adults have not completed anything, not a certificate or a degree. And many of them are in jobs that are not serving their highest value and are not serving the country. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't give everyone a chance to aspire to as much education as they want. But a degree is a badge. Just like we got badges in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, it's a badge. It happens to be a recognized badge. And a lot of higher ed innovators are talking about, why isn't a certificate a badge? And in fact, why isn't eighth grade, or maybe finishing sixth grade, or maybe we shouldn't be sixth or eighth grade. Maybe it should be acquiring a certain amount of knowledge in a certain amount of time gets you a badge.
So like sitting for the CPA exam. So you don't really, it doesn't measure how many years or how many semesters of accounting you took, although that's one of the prerequisites, but it's mainly whether you can pass the test. And so you'd have something like that for all sorts of occupations?
It's a great analogy. And for all sorts of curricula and programs and content. So we want all of our kids to know, I do at least, I don't know about a lot of people, why the American Revolution was fought and what happened. Why is that fourth grade? I was reading to my kids about it in kindergarten.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Sarah and I, back in the days when we were teaching language, and we also had a reading program. I became friends with an ex-high school football coach who'd created a program where he'd take kids that had dropped out of high school or been kicked out of high school for behavior issues, and he would take the per student allocation as his revenue, and then he would take these kids, and this was 20, 25 years ago when computers were
Very beginning.
very beginning. They look like big refrigerators, they're enormous. But he'd have them doing things with these computers in the morning, and they got through the whole high school curriculum in about 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, and then he had them going off to part-time jobs. And so they were not only learning and moving along at their own pace, but they were getting workforce training. Which
And getting
was,
money.
oh yeah, getting paid.
It's kind of like the idea of apprenticeships, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about, the word vocational is bandied around a lot today. I don't like the word vocational because the old vocational education was almost along the German model. You're in ninth grade, you don't seem quite as promising as this one over here. So by the time you get to 10th grade, you're going to go off on a bus, happened to many of my friends, and you're going to go to beautician school, or you're going to go to, some woodworking thing. And yet, they may have not gotten the foundation.
Well, it's like those old notions of working class or middle class.
Right.
I mean, Arnold Kling said if you came down from Mars and looked at the country, you couldn't conceive there's a working class and another class. Everybody's sort of lumped in together.
And so imagine taking that definition too. If you said to students starting first or second grade, they're constantly exposed to a wealth of pathways while they're learning and exploring, and they might decide by 8th grade or 7th grade or some weird time in their history that they want to be on a different path. Maybe that's a completely different kind of education in school. Maybe it's online. Maybe it's at home. Maybe it's in a college. Maybe it's in a school we've never heard of.
But I've already said you're the leading educational reformer in bringing about change in America. How do we force multiply this? I mean, how do we roll it out?
We have to do a few things, and they're hard.
Yeah.
And
Let's do the hard things.
And they buck the status quo. One is we truly have to change laws that require schools to be measured based on seat time,
Oh, yeah.
right, and numbers. So we pay for butts and seats. They're the old Carnegie units. That's how districts get funded. That's how the federal government, the state government, the local government funds schools. It doesn't matter whether you have a federal education department or not. It's irrelevant. All schools are funded based on number formulas of kids and seat time. Instead, you should be funding them based on what's happening locally and whether there's competency. Student-centered
Certification
funding.
or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Now, we went through this whole thing with No Child Left Behind, teaching for the test and that sort of thing. How do you avoid that trap?
So, the teaching to the test, in a way, was a necessary evil. And I don't want to even say teaching the test. The testing was a necessary evil. Teaching the test
I think
came
testing
about,
is
right?
essential.
The teaching the test came because this system that we're trying to transform didn't know how to react to these incentives or the sticks and the carrot. So rather than saying, oh my gosh, they say that our kids should know this level of math, whatever it happens to be by 4th grade, we're not going to teach them math. We're just going to make sure they test well in math.
So
it shows the flaw of the system that people felt like they had to teach to the test or just, no. They felt like they had to practice testing.
got it.
What teach to the test means
So
really
they weren't learning, they were just
is
learning to take tests.
They were practicing the test.
Yeah.
And in
got
the
it.
process, some kids learned.
Yeah.
And actually, we saw a huge bump in
Yeah,
minority kids'
But there's not
scores.
much evidence that sticks.
Right. Exactly.
In
It's not
fact, there's a lot of
persistent.
evidence that it doesn't stick.
Right. Right. And by the way, the corollary is on the nation's report card, the states where there's more flexibility, more autonomy, more innovations happening, their black and brown kids in particular, but all students, particularly those in charter schools, went up 8 to 10 percentage points over the last few assessments.
And seat time is JK through 12,
Yeah.
all the way through. Now,
And your diploma
that's
is
a big
based
one.
on
So if you
time.
said to parents and voters, look, if you really want educational change, let's rethink this whole thing. That's a cause.
How about you don't get a diploma for graduating 12 years? How about your diploma is based on competency?
That you don't get one if you don't get it within 12
If you
years?
don't, you get it whenever you've mastered the program of instruction.
Well, I like that. More time for golf.
Exactly.
So seat time, that's a big one. What else? Is there another big one that you could say, gee, if we could change seat time, that would change a lot?
Well,
What else?
Teacher certification and teacher education. I mean,
Okay.
that's the reinforcement that you have to be sitting in rows, right? You're being taught basically most of teacher education, except at the more, I'd say, progressive institutions, are about classroom management. You know, there's a dean of Boston College who was actually at Penn when I was there, who taught about Dewey. He taught about differential ways to think about language, how we all come to language. He talked about community. I remember thinking, oh my God, we're going to talk about John Dewey. This is going to be crazy. It was interesting because he was talking about the foundations of education, asking people in this class, some of who were going to become teachers, most who are going to become entrepreneurs in education, how to think about students. That's different than I show up to get my certification, and I'm told that if I turn on and off the lights 5 times, my kids will quiet down if they're in 3rd grade.
So we need to have certification based on classroom mastery? Or
Certification
classroom?
should be based on, you should be able to hire a teacher who does something really well and proves that they've got some experience in their content field.
Well, we've been through that with Language Odyssey.
Yeah,
We-
in Indiana, 20 years ago, I don't know if it's the same, if you were accredited high school Spanish teacher, you were not allowed to teach elementary Spanish.
Well, the other thing too is we had
It's unbelievable.
we had a
Oh, my gosh.
we had a program
No
in a
way.
suburb that was not unlike Schaumburg, and the Sarah had sold the teacher, the assistant superintendent for curriculum was a marvelous
Wonderful
person.
woman.
And she brought us in, and we were all set up, and we had 8 schools we were going to be teaching in. Had hired 8 teachers. We hired a couple. One of them had a PhD with Spanish, had a PhD in engineering, but wanted to teach kids. And we had all sorts of highly qualified Spanish speakers because it's an immersion program. And the Indiana Teachers Union found out about this and said, well, no, you can't. These people are not certified. And so even though they're fluent in Spanish, which works great in an immersion program.
And they were highly educated.
So,
Right.
so they said you can't hire them. So you got to hire the teachers we provide, and they provided 8 teachers, none of whom could speak Spanish.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, they knew some numbers and some food,
Okay, numbers and
colors.
all right. Anyway, how long did that program? We did it for a couple of years trying to make that work. I remember you going down there trying to teach Spanish to, and your Spanish is not.
Well,
neither one of
I-
our Spanish is all that great.
Oh,
But okay. So let's circle back to
Well,
big
so-
change.
but let
Seat
me-
time.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question back on the teachers. Do we allow doctors to practice right away after they've passed the medical exam? No, they have to have been in a hospital as a resident
Sure.
and observed and then satisfactorily validated by their supervising doctor. We do 6 weeks of classroom teaching and we go, okay, done. You
You're
went
in.
to school,
Go.
you're in.
Yeah.
So imagine if their peers could say, Sarah's coming in and doing Spanish language. Maybe Sarah's a painter, and she just happens to spend a lot of time in Spanish language exercises.
So we need sort of an apprentice program for teachers.
I think maybe part apprentice, part content. And
Okay.
yeah, I think that's a huge barrier. And then really learning to refocus the unit of measurement on the student. It's very hard. How do you decide without going like, oh, we just want schools to do anything? But if you focus the unit of measurement on the student, is the student making progress? Then I might pick a school that's different from what you might pick.
Okay, so how is that different from what we have now? Unit of measure on the student, what does that mean relative to where?
We measure schools on whether the school is progressing, whether an aggregate number of students is making progress
I got it.
on a set of tests, even before we had a federal requirement for state-by-state testing. There were, the Stanford 9, some of you have heard of, or just standardized tests. And you'd say, oh, the average number, this is where the average came from. The average number of kids is doing really well. 70% of them are doing pretty good on our state tests or on this norm reference test. And those are good, substantial measurements to get a gauge of where people are. There's been a lot of signs putting to them, not poo-pooing tests. But that doesn't mean the student is ready to graduate if they've done well, or that they're not ready to graduate because they've done poorly. Because if you're Walter Bank, who ended up being saved by a charter school in Ohio and ended up going to Ohio State, and now is graduating, and you just left the measurement of the test and didn't give him an option, he'd probably be in jail.
Okay.
Because he was that bad.
Yeah. Well, concerning outcomes, one of the thought experiments I tried when Sarah and I were toiling in the education vineyards with our programs was that we thought we were doing something better, faster, cheaper, because it's hard for elementary schools to create a language program, very
And to keep it
sophisticated,
going.
and keep it going. All sorts of issues with staging these third graders and the sixth graders. It's complicated. But we were doing it very cost effectively, and I came to think there was a thought experiment. If we were just selling a pill that we could give you, and it would teach you how to speak Spanish without any other things like that, would the education establishment let us give you that pill? Because we'd gotten rid of all the other nonsense. We just produced an outcome.
No, the answer is no, because the education establishment actually thinks that you're there to be socialized.
Okay.
And that's why they don't like homeschooling, and that's why they don't like parents choosing to go to their own charter or private school, because they think we should be socialized. Look, I'm a huge proponent of the melting pot. My dad was a recipient of, we probably talked about this before, of like tens of millions in this country, of being able to get into America and be socialized to our civic values. But we're not even doing that now. So I think our kids are pretty social without having to have the education establishment.
I think they've got that covered.
Yeah.
Well, once again, fascinating. I think we've got some solutions here. We just need to get together and make them happen. And so I'm going to sign me up for your army. Let's make some educational change.
You're
Sarah,
in.
thank you.
Yeah.
And sharing your war stories. And Jeannie, thank you.
Thank you, Bo.
I'll see you.
And
I'm
Sarah.
sure I'll see you in a few months to talk about this some more. Great. Take care.
Thanks.
America's education system was designed in a different era for a different society. We are at grave risk today from this obsolete system which fails to educate all children to succeed as adults. In fact, the system we have now was never designed or even intended to reach all children. But there is hope. The internet revolution, experiential learning, and other innovations which put the learner at its center have created a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform education. To realize this vision for all children, incremental change is not an option. What's required is radical change.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.